O'Rourke. Beto, thank you so much for talking to me today. I so appreciate it.
Hey, it is great to be with you, and thank you for everything that you are doing, everything you've done to highlight the threat to our democracy right now, and especially what's happening in Texas, a state that you are very familiar with, and I know that you keep close tabs on. So I'm very grateful to be with you.
Well, thank you, and right back at you. And you are our go-to person to know what the heck is ever going on in Texas, which, as you know, and as you just mentioned, is my own native state. So I'm always interested. But a lot of people are interested in what's going on in Texas. And one of the reasons is because we know how important it is for the rest of the country, and how in many instances, including what's going on right now, it's a bit of a canary in the coal mine. So that's what we want to talk to you about today. Everybody gets it. Everybody knows. So all these legislators left Austin. These Democrats came to Washington so that the Republicans can't have a quorum, having to do with this voting rights bill. Tell us some details. What exactly is happening?
So prior to the start of this legislative session, Texas was already the toughest state in which to vote. So we are 50th out of 50 states in ease of voting. And that is in large part because after the Supreme Court Shelby decision, which struck down key components of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Texas was left free. And when I say Texas, the Republican majority in Texas was left free to close polling places. And they've closed more than 750 of them, twice the number as the next closest state. And most of those polling place closures, Marianne, are concentrated in the fastest growing Black and brown communities in our state. They have the most onerous form of voter ID in the country. You can use your license to carry a firearm to prove who you are at the polling place, but you can't use your student ID. They have what has been described by a federal judge as a racial gerrymander, where, again, if you're Black or brown, there's a good chance you were drawn out of a congressional district to minimize the power of your vote and the likelihood that you would vote at all. That was already in play, the status quo prior to the current legislature's attempt to make it even harder, and especially for those with a disability, especially Black and brown voters, again, young voters, the very old, and those who live in big cities and urban counties like Harris County, which is home to Houston, Texas. And so those were the targeted groups for the voter suppression and voter intimidation attempts in these elections bills proposed by the Republican majority and the governor. And so the state Democrats left and went to Washington, D.C. to deny the Republican majority a quorum, so they couldn't get this stuff passed. But more importantly, in my opinion, they left so they could go to our nation's capital and provide some necessary pressure on President Biden. And though we love him and he's been so outspoken on the need to move forward with voting rights, he just has not done enough yet, and we need him to do more. And the Senate Democrats, who have the political majority to actually pass the For the People Act, which would roll back so much of this voter suppression, not just in Texas, but Georgia and Florida and so many other states across the country. If those state legislators can stay in DC and provide that moral leverage and pressure, I think we have a very good shot at passing the most significant voting rights legislation since 1965. So that's really how important this moment is, and the central role that Texas plays in it.
You know, you mentioned the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was such an important part of the civil rights. It was the year after the civil rights legislation, I believe. I think it was the year after, 1965. And then the John Roberts-led Supreme Court, as you mentioned, started gutting it. And at that time, the dissent was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said, basically, the image she used was brilliant. She said, they built in 1965 such a strong umbrella, and you're poking holes in it. And I remember John Roberts had said in his majority opinion, oh, the South is different now. We don't have to worry. She said, so what you're saying is we have this great umbrella and it's okay. We can poke holes in the umbrella now. And she said, trust me, it will start raining again. And indeed it did. And then just recently, they actually poked more holes, didn't they? So basically, they have gutted the Voting Rights Act, as though the voting rights of Black people, brown people, for whom it was written to begin with, the apotheosis really of the Civil Rights Act no longer matter. So what else is involved here? It's voting rights, but there's some other issues here as well, right? Abortion rights and critical race theory and transgender. What are the other issues that are involved in this legislation that they're trying to block?
Yeah, it's really bad. So as you alluded to, Texas has among, if not the most restrictive reproductive health care access laws in the country. So if a woman were to attempt to obtain an abortion after 6 weeks, any person could turn her in and her physician in as well and receive a $10,000 bounty, essentially. So it is deputizing kind of a citizens anti-abortion militia to go after women's health care. And we sit, Marianne, at the epicenter of a maternal mortality crisis in Texas, where women are dying at a frightening rate, and Black women are dying at 2 to 3 times the rate of white women here in Texas. And so much of that has to do with the fact that it's so hard already to see a doctor. We're the least insured state in the country. And we have made it so hard in previous legislative sessions for a woman to access an abortion. And now by criminalizing this altogether after 6 weeks, I can only imagine the terrible outcomes for women in the state. But it's not just that. They have sought to criminalize transgender children as though there's some crisis or epidemic of transgender girls playing middle school athletics, and somehow we need to focus the entire legislative power of a state of 30 million people on that issue. And perhaps what's worse than all of that is that we actually have real legitimate problems in Texas. Our power grid completely failed us in the midst of the worst winter storm in Texas history this February. More than 700 people died, including kids who literally froze to death in their beds, parents who died next to their kids of carbon monoxide poisoning as they tried to get warm in their garages by running the engines of their cars. We still haven't fixed that electricity grid. We still cannot guarantee that the power is going to come on when you need it in Texas. And you would hope, be they Republicans or Democrats, they would focus on those real problems. But instead, they are pursuing those who are already out of power or unable to get the health care or the help or the protection that they need. It's just incredibly cruel and malicious. And I wish it were a better story from here. But the silver lining in all this is, as you know, because so much of your heart is in Texas, there are so many good people in this state who are fighting the good fight. And they will be the answer to this. I promise you. And I don't know how soon we get that answer, but you're seeing evidence of it in those brave Democratic state legislators in DC. And then, millions of people here who are stepping up, standing up, speaking out, and making sure that their voice is heard on these issues. There will be a better Texas sooner rather than later, but I think we have to go through this very terrible period first.
I'm very aware of that. I want to go back a little bit to the abortion issue. They know that a bill like that will face a challenge that could go all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's really what they're trying to do, isn't it? They're trying to do that in order to give the Supreme Court an opportunity to override Roe v. Wade, to overturn it. Isn't that correct?
It seems on its face to be the purpose, because as written, this is unconstitutional and will beg the constitutional question that might be answered by a 6-3 majority on that Supreme Court, I'm afraid, which makes all of our work, wherever we are, California, Texas, New York, every place in between, all the more important, because if we don't return majorities to Congress in 2022 who will stand up for reproductive freedom, and as you know, and I think so many people who are watching this and listening to this know, Congress still has the ability to act on reproductive health care. Yes, Roe versus Wade is a law of the land, but it could be enshrined in statute through an act of Congress, the leadership of the president. So we certainly want them to act on that while they have time. And that supersedes what is happening in Texas or any other state for that matter.
Well, the same is true, like you were talking about with the voting rights. I was in a conversation with Tom Hartman. He was talking about how we act as though the Supreme Court is the final word. That's it, no matter what. They are 3 co-equal branches. And in the issue of voting rights, you were talking about for the People Act, as well as reproductive freedom, there's a lot that Congress can do, even when the Supreme Court has acted. There are so many women in the United States who are too young to remember a time when a woman could not have a safe and legal abortion, and how many women died in back alleys and coat hangers and the most horrible kinds of stories. And that's exactly what will happen again if that right is denied. Okay, so all these legislators from Texas have gone off to Washington. They're hoping. I know they had a conversation with Kamala Harris at the White House the other day. Although I want to ask you about that, Beto, because when the vice president was asked, what are you going to do about all this voter suppression? She gave the line that is the sort of traditional establishment Democratic line right now, which is, we're going to get more people to vote. We're going to have greater voter registration efforts. Is that really the bottom line answer we should be giving to this?
I'm all for hustling. And in fact, I spent the first 3 hours of my day in El Paso's Lower Valley registering voters. So I think that's a very important thing to do. But you're absolutely right. That cannot be the solution. It's absolutely insufficient to the attack on democracy. Listening to President Biden's speech in Philadelphia this week, he laid out in the starkest, most dramatic terms the threat that we face. He called us the single greatest attack on American democracy since the Civil War. He talked about,
I agree with him,
an attempt on the 6th of January, the big lie, trafficked not only by Donald Trump, but by people who are in positions of public trust in Congress right now. And then these attempts in more than 40 different state legislatures to change election law to make it harder on Black and brown and disabled and young voters to participate in our elections. And all of that was wonderful, but I'm with you when he got to the finish of the speech where I was hoping he was going to say, and that's why we need to muster the political courage to reform the filibuster and allow the passage of voting rights legislation on a simple majority or something like that. Instead, he said, we got to just go out hustle the other side and work harder. And you cannot ask, especially the Black voters who propelled his victory for the presidency in Atlanta and in Georgia and in Pennsylvania and the voters of color in Arizona. You can't just ask them to now try harder when the laws have literally been changed in those states to make it more difficult for them to vote. We all need a champion now in the White House, much the way that Lyndon Baines Johnson was a champion in 1965, where, according to the stories I've heard, he was initially reluctant on the heels of passing the Civil Rights Act in '64 to take on another major piece of civil rights legislation. But Dr. King, John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, Andrew Young, and so many other civil rights leaders from around the country pushed him and gave him the power that he didn't know he had to get this through Congress. And he did in 1965, but he used every muscle, every atom in his being to make that happen. And we need such an effort from President Biden. We need him to meet the crisis we face with the urgency it deserves. So I'm with you. Let's hustle, let's register, let's organize, let's do all those things that we typically do. But then let's have some leadership from those who are in the highest positions of power right now and have the ability and the political majority to get voting rights legislation passed.
And the fact that they have the majority, however thin, in the House, in the Senate, and the fact that they have the White House, if they don't use that leadership ability and the mandate that they have now, God help us, who knows if they'll even have it again, which takes us to what seems to me an even scarier prospect. And that is not just voter suppression laws, but voter nullification laws. So in other words, there are forces in this country that are saying, we're going to try to keep you from voting. But just in case that doesn't work, if you do vote and you vote a way that we don't like, we're going to nullify the vote. Now, then you're into total dictatorship, fascism. Forget democracy. Tell me your thoughts about voter nullification laws, not only in Texas, and also give me a broader sense of what's going on in the country. Because as we know, this is not just happening in Texas. How do you see what's happening, not only in voter suppression, but also voter nullification laws?
I'm so glad you brought that up. I don't think enough people are talking about it because maybe they don't know it's taking place. But
it's like, hello, talk about house on fire.
That's absolutely right. I mean, it's one thing, and it's bad enough to try to prevent people from voting and to place obstacles in their way, which is what Texas is doing. But it's altogether a different thing, and perhaps, as you suggest, another form of government altogether, where in Georgia they've now given the power to replace local county elections boards with hand-picked Republican partisans who will have the ability to overturn the election results. It's exactly what Rudy Giuliani and former President Donald Trump were asking of the Secretary of State in Georgia after the 2020 election. Thank God he refused to do that. But now on a county by county level, they will be able to do that in 2022 and in 2024. In Texas, one provision of the elections bill proposed earlier this year in the regular session would have allowed the state to overturn elections based simply on the allegation of fraud. It doesn't necessarily have to be proven. The fraud does not have to be sufficient to have changed the outcome of the election, but you make that allegation, the allegation is upheld, the election is overturned. Can I tell you one quick story that I think echoes what we're facing right now in our history? I've been doing some research on voting rights in Texas, and I came to the story of Washington County, and you're going to know that county. It's where Brenham is. It's about an hour or so northwest of Houston, Texas. In 1886, there are still, despite the end of Reconstruction, African-American Texans who hold public office in Washington County. But that was too much for the white leadership, and especially the white supremacist leadership in that county at the time. And they literally went into the polling places and stole the ballot boxes in an effort to violently overturn the election. There were some awful things that followed, including the lynching of 3 African-American poll workers. No one, of course, was ever found guilty for the crime, but it produced such shock and outrage in the country that the United States Congress took up a federal elections bill in 1890 to try to ensure that Black Americans could vote just like white Americans could vote. And Marianne, it's crazy. It passed the House of Representatives, where Republicans, who were then the pro-democracy party, Republicans had a majority in the House. It passed there. The Republicans had a majority in the Senate, and it was on track to pass. And it was held up by the filibuster, just like the For the People Act has been held up by the filibuster after it passed the House of Representatives. And that bill, the Federal Elections Bill of 1890, died, and we would not see another major attempt to pass voting rights legislation for 75 years in America. And so those are the consequences of a failure of moral courage. And I hope that we do not fall prey to that right now. And again, it's why I'm so glad you are focusing people's attention on this, because we cannot be spectators to this. We are not in the audience. We are active participants. We have agency in this, and we've got to use it for all it's worth right now. Just like, Fannie Lou Hamer and Dr. King and Andrew Young and John Lewis were literally willing to put their bodies out there for this country and our democracy. We've got to be willing to do the same right now.
Well, you are certainly providing that leadership in Texas. And so many of us around the country are looking to you, understanding that it is the microcosm, it is the embodiment of this problem. Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, says that when these legislators come back, they will be arrested. What's going to happen when they get back? I mean, they can't stay gone forever. They have families, they have work, they have lives, they have jobs. What happens now?
Yeah, just think about that. They have left not only their offices in the Texas Capitol, but they've left their families, their kids, their source of income, because you only make $7,200 as a state rep in Texas. So all of them have outside sources of income. They're accountants, they're attorneys, they're shopkeepers. They've left their businesses, they've left their homes, and they have to leave in order for this to work for almost a month. And they're living, as they've said, on borrowed time. And then, as you pointed out, upon return, they might very well be arrested. So if we are in need of some political courage and will at this moment, they have provided it for us. And I just want to make sure that we recognize that and encourage them, right? And support them in this effort. We, through our group Powered by People, have raised a little over $600,000 so far to support these state legislators, on this exodus to Washington, D.C., to ensure that they are not wanting for food or money for travel or lodging or really whatever they need to stay in that fight. And it's been thousands of individual donors. I think the average donation is $36. So it's a great sign and show of support for them. But yeah, this came at incredible sacrifice. But you know what? I kind of think we needed that. I think.
Oh, yeah. It's great. No, we're all very much so. It's wonderful that they did this.
Yeah, because call your senator. Yeah, maybe that matters. Get out there and give a big speech. Maybe someone's listening. But when someone risks so much for all of us, that act of sacrifice is
absolutely
transformational. It grabs our attention and it calls forth a sacrifice from us. I want to think like, man, they're doing all this. What could I be doing more than what I'm doing right now? I'm clearly not doing enough. That's what comes to
Oh,
mind.
Beto, nobody
A lot of
thinks you're
people
not doing enough. Everybody, including me, is very, very impressed by what you're doing, the work you're doing, how much you're articulating and explaining to the rest of us. By the way, I live in Washington, D.C., so tell your friends if there's anything I can do. I'm certainly, if there's anything I can do. The laws will pass, though, right? I mean, what they're doing is important in terms of hopefully motivating Washington for the people, Biden, but this law is going to pass one way or the other in Texas, isn't it?
This is the critical question, because if their moral example and the courage of their convictions is sufficient to compel the Senate to pass the For the People Act, that will stop this bill in Texas, because it will disallow the kind of voter intimidation and voter suppression tactics that are embodied in that bill. If their sacrifice fails to motivate us at this moment of truth, then yes, you're absolutely right. Then they will be called back into another special session. They'll have to accept the inevitable. That elections bill will pass, and the toughest state in the country in which to vote might become a state that no longer has a democracy or has one in
Basically.
They've purchased some time, essentially. They've given us a month within which we need the president, especially the president. I know a lot of focus has been placed on Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, and certainly we want them to do more, but it's the president uniquely, the most powerful person on the planet, who has the ability to marshal this through if he will use the full power of that office. And I think it's incumbent upon us to remind him of that power. And I think that was something that Dr. King said upon leaving a meeting with President Johnson in '64, where Johnson said, "I don't have the power to compel members of Congress." And Dr. King said to Andrew Young, "We got to go out there and find him the power." And the power was people, the people who marched, and John Lewis, most of all at the age of 24, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge and really putting his life on the line for democracy. And when Johnson convened both houses of Congress together, not more than a week after Bloody Sunday and John Lewis's near-death beating, he pointed to Selma and he said, this should shame all of us into the action that we must take. So let us all think about what we can do to give President Biden that power, much in the way that John Lewis gave President Johnson that power, to do the right thing at this critically important moment. I think that's our task.
I think the famous line, "Make me do it," although that was JFK, right? Make me do it. Every time anybody talks the way you were just talking about Johnson, the tragedy of the Vietnam War is not only the tragedy of the Vietnam War, but also the way it stopped a profoundly progressive agenda that Johnson had domestically.
That's so true.
Quite
and
tragic.
It's so sad. You may have been reading these articles as well. I was reading this morning in the Washington Post about the child tax credit that is coming through right now, that is going to be received by those who even did not receive an income last year or did not pay taxes. It's the single greatest lift of children in poverty since the Johnson years and the Great Society and the War on Poverty. And you're absolutely right. Imagine what another term of Johnson versus the first term of Nixon would have done for this country, which is perhaps something to be celebrated in President Biden beginning to withdraw us from our foreign involvements in other wars in other countries right now and focusing on very necessary problems here in America.
Even on the issue of race, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was Nixon's domestic advisor, and said America's been through enough drama on race, and his policy of what he called benign neglect. And even though they had been able to get the Civil Rights Act through, they had gotten the Voting Rights Act through, the next piece that they were going to tackle was the economic gap, which of course is such an issue today. You mentioned earlier shock and outrage, and I agree with you. Why isn't there more shock? Why isn't there more outrage? This is an attack on our democracy. And I think a lot of people who are listening right now, it's not that they don't feel the shock and outrage, but I think that there's outrage fatigue. I think there's exactly what you said earlier. How much do you want from people? People stood in line for hours and hours and hours to give you guys the majority in the Senate and the House. Do something with it. And so I think that there's this despair and paralysis. So give me something here. Tell people who are listening right now something that they can actually do to help create that change, to to help make him do it? What is the action that we can take that can make, hopefully, that can influence President Biden and others, but particularly President Biden at this point, to make the bottom line of what he's going to do about this attack on our democracy? You're correct. He's doing all kinds of things where he's indicating, I get what the problem is, but there are some areas where we're like, so then please blank. What can we do to help make that happen, Beto?
I think we have to go beyond what has been so comfortable and convenient for us, especially after last year, which is being on our devices and our screens and tweeting and Facebook posting our outrage, or signing petitions that I don't know if anybody will ever receive, or any of that stuff. I mean, I think there's a time and place for it, but right now, especially under this beautiful summer sky, we need to be engaged with one another in person, physically, outdoors, at rallies, at marches. This Saturday, in fact, affords us a perfect opportunity. It's the 1-year anniversary of the death of John Lewis. And there are vigils being organized in more than 100 cities, including in Washington, D.C. and in El Paso, where anyone can go and not only pay tribute to the life of one of the greatest heroes in the pantheon of democracy, but also remind ourselves of what his life's work really was about, from riding those buses and the Freedom Rides, I think in his very early 20s, to crossing that Edmund Pettus Bridge when he was all of 24 years old, to his service in Congress. He made his life's work all of us and our ability to participate in our government. And he called the vote the most powerful nonviolent tool that we have. And he talked about democracy not being a state, but being an act. And so I think about his commandment that we act, and that we not simply witness or watch or criticize or cheer, but we are the actors in this drum. We are the players on this field, whatever the correct metaphor is. So we got to get out there. And I think that is so transcendent at this moment, that is so consumed by our screens, to actually be out there. And you know this because you're so good at it, but it feels so good. I mean, I was just out registering voters in the Lower Valley. Outside, it's 90 degrees already. It's a little hot, but it was so nice to see people and have conversations about what's going on in this country and why I think it's so important that you register to vote. If we can do that on larger scales together, organizing in our own communities where no one else has organized for us, that's also part of democracy. And it takes you beyond waiting for the next election or just hoping that some savior is going to ride into the rescue. It's us, we're the ones who are coming to the rescue of this country. So whether it's this Saturday or something else, get out there and get involved.
I think also the 22 elections, John Lewis, of course, said make good trouble. But when John Lewis and others made good trouble, Congress listened more than they listen today. I mean, the BLM protests were the greatest protest movement in the United States history. And yet, what do we have to show for it in terms of legislative change? So I don't think we should pretend. I mean, people are smart now. They get, and absolutely, I didn't know about this weekend vigil. I'll definitely participate. I'm speaking at the Medicare for All rally here in Washington on the 24th. But I think people have also come to understand that there's a limit to how much certain people in the government seem to even care that we're out there. So I think I'd like to end with a little call about the congressional elections in 2022. It has always seemed to me, Beto, that the Republicans have had a little greater psychological sophistication about their political activism. They've never relegated it to just the presidential election years. They're in there on the school board elections. They're in there on those state legislature elections. We need more young people to run for state legislature. The most nefarious stuff happening now is on the level of these state houses. We need more young people. When young people say to me, how do we pressure our lawmakers to do differently? I think, I often say, don't think in terms of pressuring them. Think in terms of replacing them. You run for city council, you start running, you run for the school board, you run for state legislature. And also, let's not forget the midterms in 2022, everyone. And I want to thank you, Beto, for talking to Jessica Mason. who is such a wonderful candidate there in Texas, and to all of you. Remember to go to candidatesummit.com. Two wonderful candidates that I know are running for Congress in Texas next year, Charles Thompson and Jessica Mason, but I'm sure that there are definitely others too. So let's not leave out that we've got midterms next year. And if we want Congress to act differently, the last thing we can afford is for the Republicans to get the House or to get the Senate, but we need more than the status quo too. We not only need the Democrats to control it, we need a particular kind of Democrat to control it. Hint, hint, go Nina Turner. So anything else, Beto, that you want to mention? Everything you say is so important for us. Thank you. Anything else?
Well, I would just echo what you said. I mean, yes, register, yes, vote, yes, get out in the streets and protest to make sure you're heard. But absolutely run for office. And there will never be a perfect time to do it. You'll never be the perfect candidate. You'll never have all the answers to all the questions. None of us do who run for office. But the very act of getting out there and getting in front of people and getting after it is transformative for you personally and for all of us as a country. And I encourage more people to do that at every level of the ballot, from city council and county commissioner all the way up. And if I can be of help here in Texas for anyone who's thinking about it, please reach out. And we're all about making sure that we field the strongest ballot of candidates in 2022 that Texas has ever seen. So we'll be doing our part.
I think you're great. You clearly do your part. And I want all of you to know, whenever I know of anything going on in Texas, and I think maybe Beto would be able to help. I have seen through my own interactions with him, he's such the real deal. And you've always been so great. We're all watching, we're all listening. And on behalf of everybody here today, thank you. Keep it up, Beto. We'll do what we can. And you tell your friends that are in Washington, make sure they know how much we all appreciate their being here.
Thank you
God
so
bless
much
you, honey.
for everything you're doing, Marianne. Very grateful to you.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Adios.